The Dorran family arrived in the small, quiet village of Brindlewood in the late autumn of 1885. They came as quietly as the falling leaves, without much fanfare, but their presence quickly drew the eyes of the town. The Dorrans were different from the others, polished, well-spoken, and possessing a quiet air of nobility that spoke of wealth. Their large estate, nestled on the edge of a sprawling forest, seemed to rise from the land like something ancient, as if it had always been there waiting for them. The house was an imposing structure of gray stone and ivy, its windows dark and watchful. To the villagers, it was the type of home that whispered of secrets. The Dorrans introduced themselves with care, attending every local gathering, speaking with the most influential figures in town, and making sure that their presence was felt in the community. It was not long before the village grew accustomed to them. Lord Frederick Dorran, the patriarch, was a man who commanded attention with his calculated charm and a quiet voice that somehow filled any room he entered. His wife, Lady Beatrice, was a woman of grace and composure, a picture of maternal warmth. The couple had no children of their own, but their actions spoke louder than any words. They became known for their charitable work, adopting children who had been abandoned or orphaned. The village had long struggled with poverty and misfortune, and many children found themselves cast aside, their futures uncertain. The Dorrans, it seemed, offered a glimmer of hope. At first, their kindness was met with gratitude. The townspeople saw their generosity as a blessing, especially when the Dorrans took in the first child, a young girl named Emily. Emily had been found alone, wandering the woods near the village, her clothes ragged and her eyes wide with fear. The Dorrans took her in without question, offering her a home and a future. But it was not long before something changed. Emily, once a bright-eyed girl full of laughter, grew quiet and distant. She would spend hours staring out the windows of the grand estate, as though waiting for something or someone. And then, one morning, Emily was gone. She disappeared without a trace. There were no signs of a struggle, no footprints left behind, and no clue as to where she had gone. The town was unsettled, but the Dorrans seemed unaffected, their smiles unbroken, their composure intact. They insisted that Emily had run away, that she had been troubled, and that she had simply decided to leave. But the villagers couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Whispers spread like wildfire. Some claimed to have seen strange figures near the Dorran estate late at night. Others spoke of odd noises, murmurs of ritual, of things happening behind closed doors. No one could say for certain, but as the years passed, more children vanished from the Dorrans' home. Some were barely old enough to speak, others still in the cradle. And each time the Dorrans were unshaken. They never seemed to show the slightest sign of concern. The town's suspicions deepened, but no one dared to speak out. To question the Dorrans was to question the fabric of society itself. They had become too ingrained in the village's life, their influence too strong. And so the mystery continued to grow, like a dark stain spreading across a once pristine sheet. With each new child that disappeared, the townspeople began to ask themselves, were the Dorrans truly the benevolent benefactors they appeared to be? Or was there something darker hidden beneath their polished surface? Something that was now beyond the reach of the law, beyond the reach of any hope for redemption. As the whispers grew louder, so did the weight of the truth that no one could yet see. a truth that had been carefully buried beneath layers of smiles, charity, and carefully curated lies. But in the shadows the Dorrans waited, patient and calculating, knowing that in time all would be revealed. And when that moment came, it would not be in the way anyone expected. The Dorran Manor stood on the outskirts of Brindlewood, a towering structure that seemed to loom over the town like a dark sentinel. Its Gothic spires pierced the sky, and its stone walls, weathered by time, appeared to hold secrets in their very mortar. The estate was surrounded by thick, gnarled trees, their branches twisted like the fingers of forgotten ghosts, and the air around the manor always seemed colder, even in the summer. It was a place that drew people in, yet somehow made them uneasy. The villagers, while intrigued by the grandeur of the house, couldn't shake the feeling that something about it was wrong. There was an unsettling quiet to the place, as if it were hiding something that shouldn't be found. The Dorrans, however, were never ones to shy away from attention. They hosted lavish gatherings at the manor, drawing in the wealthiest and most influential figures from the surrounding areas. Among the regular guests was the infamous Sir Thomas Barnard, a Victorian doctor whose name was whispered in both awe and fear. Known for his unorthodox medical theories, Sir Thomas had made a name for himself as an expert in child development. But there was something strange about his methods. He was often seen speaking with Lord Frederick Dorran in hushed tones, his thin lips curling into a smile that never quite reached his eyes. Rumors abounded about Sir Thomas's experiments, but few dared to speak openly about them. Behind closed doors, the manor became a place of secretive rituals, and no one outside of the Dorran family could say for certain what occurred within its walls. The children, once brought in with the promise of a better life, were never seen again. It began with Emily, the first adopted child, and then others followed. At first it seemed as if the children had simply run away, but as time passed, the pattern became undeniable. Each time the Dorrans claimed to have no idea where the children had gone, insisting that they had wandered off into the woods or disappeared into the night. Yet each disappearance seemed more deliberate than the last, and with each child that vanished, the air around the manor grew heavier. The townspeople began to whisper about the Dorrans' strange practices, their charitable facades now seen through with suspicion. Some claimed to have seen figures moving behind the windows of the manor at odd hours of the night, their movements too deliberate, too coordinated to be normal. Others spoke of hearing strange sounds drifting from the estate, murmurs, chanting, whispers that seemed to come from deep within the house. But the most chilling of all were the rumors about Sir Thomas Barnard. It was said that his experiments were not the innocent research of a scientist seeking to improve child development, but something far darker. Some claimed that he was testing the limits of human endurance, pushing children beyond their breaking point in the name of medical progress. Others believed that his theories were not of the mind at all, but of the soul, as if he were attempting to unlock something far more sinister, something that could not be explained by science alone. Still, none of this was ever confirmed, for there was no concrete evidence, no bodies, no documents to prove what was truly happening. The Dorrans kept their records deliberately scarce, their adoption paperwork vague and incomplete. It was as if they had taken great care to erase any trace of the children who passed through their doors. They became masters of obscurity, their lives shrouded in an impenetrable fog that no one could pierce. Those who had known the Dorrans before their arrival in Brindlewood were too afraid to speak of them, and those who came after, having been pulled into the web of the family's charm, were either complicit or silenced. As the years wore on, the manor became a place of dread, a place where children once full of life and hope were now nothing but whispers in the wind. The town lived in the shadow of the Dorrans, watching from a distance, unable or unwilling to confront the darkness that had taken root in their midst. The truth seemed too terrifying to face, and so the manor stood, still and silent, waiting for the next child to be brought in, waiting for the next experiment to begin. And with each new disappearance, the whispers grew louder, the suspicion more intense. But the Dorrans remained ever composed, ever patient, never betraying the slightest sign of guilt. They were masters of their facade, and it was only a matter of time before the town would realize that the true horror lay not in the children who disappeared, but in the hearts of those who had welcomed them into their home. Detective Jonathan Graves had lived in Brindlewood long enough to understand the unspoken rules of the town. Secrets were buried deep, and questions rarely led anywhere but to dead ends. But when he was called to investigate the latest disappearance, a young boy named Samuel, he knew this case was different. The Dorrans had become too entangled in the town's fabric to ignore, and with each child that vanished from their care, something darker seemed to grow. The Dorrans, despite their wealth and influence, were not above suspicion. Samuel was the fourth child to disappear in as many months, and the town's anxiety was palpable. The villagers whispered that the Dorrans were hiding something. Graves was not one to jump to conclusions, but the pattern was undeniable. The children were always taken in the night, always gone without a trace. No struggle, no sign of violence, just an eerie emptiness left in their wake. When Graves arrived at the manor, the air around it felt charged, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for him to uncover the truth. Lord Frederick Dorran welcomed him with the same practiced smile he always wore, a smile that seemed just a little too wide, a little too rehearsed. His voice was smooth like silk, but it did not put Graves at ease. Lady Beatrice, standing beside him, exuded warmth, her eyes wide with concern for the missing child, yet something in her gaze made the detective uncomfortable, as if she were more interested in maintaining the appearance of sorrow than in the child's actual fate. Their answers to his questions were clipped, polite, yet evasive. They both insisted that Samuel had likely run away just as Emily had, just as the others had before him. The Dorrans seemed to expect no further questioning, and their calm demeanor unnerved Graves. There was no sorrow in their voices, no genuine concern, just a practiced, polite indifference that only deepened the detective's suspicion. Something didn't add up. As Graves spent more time at the manor, he began to notice small, unsettling details. The children's rooms were always immaculate, as if never lived in. There were no personal belongings, no signs of the lives these children were supposed to have built within the walls of the Dorran estate. He found it strange that each child had never made a mark on the place, never left behind a memory. It was as if they had never truly existed. The Dorrans spoke of them in passing, but the way they did so detached, so rehearsed, was unnatural. They claimed to have records of the children they had adopted, but whenever Graves asked to see them, Lord Frederick would deflect, citing the need to protect the privacy of their charges. The detectives' inquiries were met with subtle resistance, and with each refusal, the atmosphere in the manor grew more suffocating. The deeper Graves dug, the more disturbing his findings became. The Dorrans' connection to Sir Thomas Barnard, the renowned doctor, was far more sinister than anyone had realized. Sir Thomas was a frequent guest at the manor, and his medical experiments, which had once been regarded as controversial but legitimate, had now become something far darker, something that twisted the very nature of his original intentions. Graves learned that Sir Thomas had been conducting a series of studies on child development, but they were not studies of growth or intelligence. They were studies of pain, of endurance, of submission. The detective uncovered journals, hidden, tucked away in a locked drawer of Lord Dorrans' study, where Sir Thomas detailed the experiments he had been performing on the children. He called them trials, but they were nothing more than torturous methods designed to break a child's spirit, to strip away their humanity until they were nothing more than vessels for his sick theories. The children were not adopted to be loved. They were adopted to be tested, to be shaped into something that could never be whole again. Sir Thomas's goal was to find the perfect specimen, to create a child devoid of weakness, a child who could withstand anything, pain, fear, hunger, and even death. Graves shuddered as he read the accounts. One entry described a child named Sarah, whose hands had been bound for days, forcing her to stay awake, her mind unraveling under the strain. Another entry described the sacrifice of purity, where the child was made to endure a ceremony meant to cleanse them of all innocence. The rituals were not just medical, they were ceremonial, designed to break both body and spirit in the name of science and some twisted notion of purity. The more Graves read, the clearer it became. The Dorrans were not just adopting children, they were creating a legacy built on pain and suffering. A dynasty where each child was nothing more than a pawn in a grotesque game of human experimentation. The Dorrans were not saviors. They were monsters hiding behind a facade of philanthropy. And their crimes were not just personal, they were systemic. The Dorrans had woven themselves into the very fabric of the town, pulling strings behind the scenes to ensure that no one ever questioned their motives. Graves realized that uncovering the truth might be the last thing he ever did. The Dorrans were too powerful, too embedded in the town's life to be easily toppled. But as the horror of what they had done washed over him, he knew that he had no choice but to try. He had to stop them, even if it meant going up against an empire of lies built on the broken bodies of innocent children. The detective stood in the manor's dimly lit hallway, the walls seeming to close in around him. He had uncovered the truth, but now he had to decide whether he could survive long enough to expose it. The Dorrans were watching, and they would stop at nothing to protect their secret. The town of Brindlewood, once peaceful and untouched by the horrors that often haunted the far corners of the world, had begun to feel like a place from which the light had slowly drained. The Dorrans, with their calm demeanor and polished exterior, had woven themselves into the fabric of the town with ease, their wealth and generosity masking the dark tide that surged beneath the surface. What had once been seen as kindness, adopting orphaned children and offering them a life of security, had now become something else entirely. Jonathan Graves had spent weeks combing through every available scrap of information, his hands trembling as he pieced together the truth. Every report, every diary entry, every whispered rumor pointed in one direction. The Dorrans were not merely fostering children, they were purging them. It started with the small, subtle signs, children who came in bright-eyed and hopeful, only to be reduced to hollow, fearful shells within weeks. The children were kept in isolation for days at a time, and whenever they emerged from their rooms, their eyes were dull, their smiles forced. A change had taken root in them, a change that no one could explain, and the town never dared ask questions. It was Sir Thomas Barnard, the man who had once been seen as an esteemed figure in the world of medicine, who had brought this terror to life. His reputation as a doctor of child development had been celebrated across England, yet his work was far from the noble pursuit of science it appeared to be. Barnard had been experimenting not with the mind or with medicine, but with something far darker. His theories had evolved from research into child psychology into something twisted, something that seemed to take on an almost supernatural aspect. The methods he prescribed to the Dorrans were not those of any doctor who cared for his patients. They were brutal, dehumanizing practices designed not to nurture the children but to break them. The rituals began with the most basic of tortures: sleep deprivation, starvation. For days the children were kept awake, forced to sit in silence, their minds unraveling under the strain of exhaustion. Their bodies grew gaunt, hollowed out by hunger. Their faces pale as the spirits of the children they once were slipped further away. Sir Thomas Barnard's rationale for this, however, was chillingly simple. He believed that the purity of a child's mind needed to be cleansed, that in order for a child to reach their full potential, they needed to shed their innocence. Only by purging this innocence could they be remade into something stronger, something resilient. The children were not seen as human beings, they were seen as experiments. Tools in a ritual that would reshape them into something more. Something that could endure, that could withstand whatever horrors life would throw at them. The Dorrans, complicit in this dark process, had become the agents of this twisted transformation. They believed, as Barnard had convinced them, that this was their duty, to purify these children, to break them down to their very essence, so that they might emerge stronger and purer than before. But the worst was yet to come. The culmination of Sir Thomas's work, the ultimate ritual he had devised, was something far more grotesque: the sacrifice of purity. The details of this ritual were murky, pieced together from cryptic journal entries and whispered confessions from those who had dared to speak out. The sacrifice was the final step in the process, a ceremonial act meant to sever the last remnants of the children's innocence. The child was bound, stripped of everything familiar, and then subjected to a series of horrific trials meant to break them completely. Their bodies would be starved beyond recognition, their minds shattered by hours of isolation, and when they finally broke, when they could no longer remember who they were, the ritual would be complete. They were then purified, their spirits said to be cleansed of everything weak. They were made empty vessels, ready to be molded into the perfect, unfeeling subjects of Sir Thomas's cruel experiments. and the Dorrans watched, seemingly detached, as these children were transformed into nothing more than broken shells. They had grown numb to the suffering, their actions justified by the belief that they were working for some higher cause. The children were no longer children, they were sacrifices, offerings to a twisted god of purity that the Dorrans had created in their own minds. Jonathan Graves, once a man of reason and order, found himself consumed by the horrors he had uncovered. He could no longer deny the truth, though the truth was more than he could bear. The Dorrans were not simply hiding behind a veneer of normalcy, they were the architects of this nightmare. And yet they carried on their public lives untouched, their influence in the town unchallenged. The children continued to vanish, their names erased from existence as though they had never been there at all. The Dorrans had become the embodiment of evil, methodical and cold, hidden beneath a mask of charity and respectability. But the truth, so horrifying in its simplicity, could not be ignored forever. The rituals continued, the sacrifices never ceased, and the town of Brindlewood, once a place of peace, had become a place where innocence was purged and humanity was lost. Graves stood at the edge of the manor, his heart heavy with the weight of the knowledge he had uncovered. He had seen enough to know that there was no stopping the Dorrans now. The darkness had taken root in the town, and it would not let go. The Dorrans believed with a twisted conviction that coursed through their very veins that innocence was a poison that needed to be purged. They had convinced themselves that the only way to bring purity to the world was through a sacrificial act, an act so barbaric and vile that it would forever reshape their vision of what was pure and righteous. The sacrifice of purity was not merely a ritual, it was an ideology, a belief that the destruction of a child's soul would purify their essence, making them part of something greater than themselves. The ceremony was a sacred tradition in the eyes of the Dorrans, a way of ridding the world of what they saw as the inherent weakness of innocence. They believed they were acting out of divine necessity, their cruel acts justified as a necessary evil in the pursuit of societal progress. To them, these were not children, they were vessels, empty, waiting to be filled with the purity of suffering. It began with a slow and methodical stripping away of the child's humanity. The Dorrans, ever composed, would begin their work weeks in advance. The children would be isolated from the others, kept alone in rooms with no windows, no light, no sound. Just a crushing silence that seeped into their minds and gnawed at their sanity. They were starved of food, deprived of sleep, kept on the edge of exhaustion and delirium until their bodies withered and their minds fractured. This, the Dorrans believed, was the first step, breaking the child's spirit, forcing them to lose all sense of self. They called it purification. With each passing day, the child's voice grew quieter, their eyes duller, and their thoughts more muddled. The child, once full of laughter and life, was now a hollow shell, a being teetering on the edge of death itself. It was not enough for the Dorrans to simply break the child physically. The children's hearts and minds were torn apart in ways that defied reason. They were subjected to tests, tortures meant to push them beyond any human endurance. A child's screams would echo through the manor, but no one would answer. The Dorrans remained silent, their faces blank with the belief that this was the path to something higher, something purer. The children were forced to endure the horrors with no escape, their innocence stripped from them like the last remnants of a dying star. These methods of torment, masked as medical experiments, were designed to strip away every trace of humanity in the name of purity. The children were made to endure grueling hours, sometimes days of solitude, hunger, and suffering, their bodies aching, their spirits broken. But it was only when the final act, the sacrifice itself, was upon them that the true horror unfolded. The sacrifice of purity was not just a ritual, it was a cleansing. The Dorrans, in their warped view, were offering these children to some higher power, convinced that by purging them of their humanity they were gifting the world something greater. The ceremony itself took place in a hidden chamber within the manor, a room that none of the other children were allowed to see. The walls were draped in shadows, the air thick with the stench of death. There the child would be bound, stripped of every remaining shred of resistance. The Dorrans would stand over them, their faces unblinking, their hands steady. The child, already half dead from the torment they had endured, would be forced to stare into the void of their inevitable death, to face the emptiness that had been created by their suffering. And then they would die. It was a death unlike any other, deliberate, ritualistic, and final. No effort was spared in ensuring that the child's spirit would be gone, never to return. The Dorrans would watch as the life left the child's eyes, as the last trace of innocence was eradicated in a single moment. This was purity in their eyes, a death that was framed as a divine calling. It was necessary, they believed, for the world to be saved, for society to be made whole again. The ritual would be finished, and in their minds the world would be one step closer to redemption. But there was no redemption. Only the broken remains of innocence, discarded and forgotten. The children who passed through the Dorrans' doors were never remembered for who they had been. They were never mourned. They were sacrificed in the name of a cruel and twisted belief, nothing more than pawns in the hands of the Dorrans' warped sense of righteousness. The Dorrans had created their own religion, their own divine path. They believed with chilling certainty that they were making a greater sacrifice for the world, a sacrifice that would purify the souls of those who had been taken from the innocent, those who had been broken. But what the Dorrans did not understand was that the purity they sought was not something that could be attained through death. They had erased innocence, but they had only created a darkness far deeper than they could comprehend. As the Dorrans stood over the bodies of the children they had destroyed, their hands trembling with the false belief that they had done something noble, they could not see that it was not purity they had obtained, but a corruption that would last forever, a stain on their souls that no ritual could cleanse. The sacrifice was complete, but the price of purity would haunt them for the rest of their lives, a burden they could never escape. And as the manor stood silent, as the last remnants of innocence were erased, the evil that had taken root within the Dorrans would continue to grow, feeding on the broken bodies and minds of the children who had been discarded in the name of a twisted false divinity. Detective Jonathan Graves had seen horrors before, but the truth he was uncovering about the Dorran family was unlike anything he had ever imagined. Each page of the journals he discovered seemed to sink him deeper into a nightmare that clawed at his mind, making him question not only his own sanity but the very nature of evil itself. The journals were written by Sir Thomas Barnard, the man who had become the architect of the Dorrans' cruel and twisted experiments. Barnard's words were chilling in their cold, clinical tone, as if he were writing not about human lives but about mere subjects to be studied, dissected, and discarded. Graves read, his heart racing, as Barnard detailed each experiment, each ritual. The children, he wrote, were nothing but raw material, innocent souls meant to be purified through pain and suffering. They were not children to him. They were tools to test his theories of human endurance, of breaking the spirit to reach some twisted higher plane. But it was not just Barnard's experiments that sickened Graves. It was the Dorrans' willing participation in these horrors. The family had fully embraced Barnard's philosophy. They were no longer merely adopting children. They were subjects in a monstrous trial, caught in a system that used their innocence to serve a deranged purpose. The Dorrans had become more than just accomplices. They were the facilitators, the ones who set the stage for each unspeakable act, guiding each child down a path of suffering that ended in death. Graves shuddered as he read the passages where Barnard described the sacrifice of purity, the ritual where the children were not only tortured but killed in a grotesque ceremony meant to purge them of their humanity. These were not medical experiments. These were religious rites, twisted in their belief that the sacrifice of innocence could somehow save the world. The more Graves uncovered, the more he felt the suffocating weight of the Dorrans' influence over the town. Every corner of Brindlewood seemed to be touched by their power. The mayor, the sheriff, even the local priest, all had been too afraid to confront the Dorrans, too fearful of the repercussions to challenge the family that had woven itself so deeply into the town's fabric. Graves had expected resistance, but not like this. The further he dug, the more he realized just how carefully the Dorrans had cultivated their empire of silence. They were untouchable not by law but by fear. When Graves first confronted Lord Frederick Dorran with what he had found, the man had smiled, a chilling, empty smile that did not reach his eyes. "You have no idea, Detective," Dorran had said, his voice smooth and calm, "of the forces you are playing with. You've crossed a line and there is no turning back." The words haunted Graves as he continued his investigation, knowing deep down that the Dorrans had already marked him as a threat. It was not long before he felt the weight of their eyes on him at every turn. The subtle threats began. An unmarked carriage following him late at night, a shadow moving just outside his window, the faintest whisper in the street that he had no business asking too many questions. It wasn't long before those whispers became threats. He received an anonymous letter, its contents simple but chilling. "Stop now or the next body will be yours." But Graves could not stop. The truth had become a fire inside him, consuming everything. The children, the families, the lives torn apart by the Dorrans, it all bled together in his mind. A web of cruelty that stretched across the town, and he could not let it rest. The more Graves pressed, the more the danger escalated. His nights became sleepless, his days filled with the suffocating knowledge that the Dorrans were watching. His every move was being tracked, and every time he walked through Brindlewood he felt the weight of hundreds of eyes on his back. Yet even with this growing sense of paranoia, Graves refused to back down. He knew that if he stopped now, if he allowed the Dorrans to win, the truth would be buried forever. The children would have died in vain, their lives erased in service to a twisted family's delusion. Graves had to expose them. But just as he thought he was closing in on the final pieces of the puzzle, something shifted. It was subtle at first. Whispers in the streets, a change in the way people looked at him. The townspeople began to withdraw, their faces set in expressions of quiet fear. The mayor, whom Graves had confided in, turned his back on him, his eyes glazed over with an unspoken understanding. The sheriff, once a staunch ally, now avoided him entirely. Graves was alone in his pursuit, and the closer he got to the truth, the more the walls closed in. He could feel the danger wrapping around him like a noose. It was not long before Graves found himself in hiding, his life hanging in the balance. He had seen too much, uncovered too many truths. And now the Dorrans were closing in. But before he disappeared into the shadows, he left behind a warning. He sent an anonymous letter to the local paper detailing everything he had uncovered, the names of the children, the methods used by the Dorrans, and the twisted experiments that had been carried out under the guise of medical science. He did not expect the town to act, but he hoped that somehow the truth would find its way to those who had the courage to stop the Dorrans. The letter was short, but it carried the weight of everything he had learned. What has happened here cannot be undone. The Dorrans have buried the truth beneath layers of silence and fear. If anyone ever dares to listen, remember, this was never about science. This was about something far darker. A warning before it's too late. The day Graves disappeared, the town of Brindlewood seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. The Dorrans had won, and their dark empire remained intact. But the seed of fear had been planted. The town would never be the same again. Though the authorities refused to act, though the Dorrans continued their reign of terror, the truth was out there, waiting to be uncovered. It would take time, but one day the town would remember what had happened. And when that day came, there would be no hiding from the reckoning. The Dorrans might have silenced Jonathan Graves, but they could never erase the truth. As Detective Jonathan Graves pieced together the remnants of his investigation, he began to see a pattern emerging, one far darker and more insidious than he could have ever imagined. The Dorran family, so entrenched in the town's fabric, were not merely perpetrators of evil. They were pawns, controlled by something far greater. The true nature of the Dorrans was not just a twisted family legacy. It was the legacy of a much darker force, a force that had shaped the family for generations and would continue to control them for as long as they lived. The Dorrans had built their wealth, their power, their influence on the broken backs of the children they had sacrificed. But the children were not the true cost. No, the cost had been far more insidious. It was the soul of the family itself. Lord Frederick Dorran, the family patriarch, was a puppet, his strings pulled by unseen hands, his every move controlled by a group far older and more powerful than anyone in Brindlewood realized. The cult of purity had wormed its way into the very core of the Dorran family, a secret society that believed purity could only be achieved through destruction, through the annihilation of innocence. The Dorrans had been chosen long ago not because of their wealth or their position in society, but because of their bloodline. Their family had been marked, cursed with a legacy that bound them to the cult's dark purpose. The family's rise to power had been carefully orchestrated, with each sacrifice, each twisted act moving them closer to fulfilling the cult's vision of a world purged of weakness. Lord Frederick's own father had been a part of the cult, and his father before him, each one passing down the mantle of obedience to the family's twisted creed. Lord Frederick had been groomed from a young age to fulfill the cult's needs, to become the perfect vessel for their vision. He had never known freedom. His every choice, every decision had been made by those who held power over him, manipulating him with whispers and promises of divine purpose. As Graves dug deeper, he found traces of the cult's influence everywhere. In the meticulously recorded journals of Sir Thomas Barnard, in the carefully hidden documents buried deep within the Dorran estate, in the way the townspeople whispered behind closed doors. Too terrified to speak out, the truth was a festering wound hidden beneath the surface of Brindlewood's quiet exterior. The cult's methods were surgical, precise. They didn't just manipulate, they consumed body and soul. Each member of the Dorran family had been molded to serve the cult's vision, each one broken in their own way. Lord Frederick, once a man of ambition, was nothing more than a hollow shell, driven by a force he could neither comprehend nor resist. His wife, Lady Beatrice, was no less ensnared. She had once been a vibrant woman full of life and promise. But the cult's grip on her had turned her into something cold, calculating. She had never questioned the rituals, never questioned the sacrifices. She believed with every fiber of her being that what they were doing was right, that the children they offered up were merely pawns in a greater game. The Dorrans had built their empire on the belief that they were doing the world a service, purging it of weakness, creating a stronger, more resilient society. They had convinced themselves that their actions were justified, that the sacrifice of innocence was necessary for the greater good. But the cost of their actions was steep, and it was beginning to show. The Dorrans' wealth, their influence, had been won with blood, children's blood. And the more children they sacrificed, the deeper their bond with the cult became. The Dorrans had long since ceased to be mere people. They were vessels for a much darker force, puppets who danced on invisible strings, controlled by a power that had long since stopped caring about the cost of its demands. The town of Brindlewood, once a peaceful haven, had become the backdrop for a horrific tragedy. A community caught in the web of the Dorrans' influence. The truth was there, staring Graves in the face, but he could feel the weight of it, the suffocating pressure that came with understanding the true depths of the Dorrans' evil. The authorities, the very people who should have stood up to this darkness, were paralyzed by fear. The mayor, the sheriff, even the church, each one had been manipulated either through direct coercion or the more subtle threat of the Dorrans' power. Graves had no allies. He had no one left to turn to. The Dorrans' grip on Brindlewood was absolute, and the cost of challenging them would be more than anyone could bear. As the detective pieced together the fragments of this grotesque puzzle, the full weight of his discovery crushed him. The Dorrans were not the true masterminds of this evil. They were merely pawns in a game that stretched back centuries, their family bound to a fate they could not escape. The cult had chosen them, and they had become their instruments of destruction. Lord Frederick and Lady Beatrice would never break free. They would continue their rituals, continue their sacrifices until the day they were consumed by the very darkness they had allowed to take root in their souls. The legacy of the Dorrans' evil would live on, fed by the blood of innocent children, until there was nothing left of the family but a hollow shell, a symbol of the corruption that had taken hold of their hearts. And as Graves stared into the abyss, knowing that there was no stopping the Dorrans now, he couldn't help but wonder how many others like them had been consumed by the cult's insidious grip. How many others had been molded into instruments of evil, their wills broken, their souls lost in the name of some twisted higher cause. The Dorrans were only the beginning, and that thought chilled him to his core. The truth about the Dorrans was far more disturbing than anything Detective Graves could have ever anticipated. The family, once seen as benevolent benefactors, had built their empire not on hard work or inherited wealth, but on something darker, something more insidious. A foundation made of shattered innocence and broken bodies. The wealth they displayed so openly, the power they wielded so effortlessly, was not earned through business or politics. It was the result of countless lives sacrificed in the name of a twisted, ritualistic belief system. A belief that had bound them to something far more ancient and far more dangerous than they could have ever known. The Dorrans were not the masterminds of this horrific empire they had created. They were merely the tools of something far larger, far more powerful. They were pawns in a game controlled by the cult of purity, a shadowy organization whose reach extended further than anyone in Brindlewood had ever suspected. This cult, with its promises of immortality and divine righteousness, had manipulated the Dorran family for generations, ensuring that each act of cruelty, each sacrifice was carried out without question. It was the cult of purity that had chosen Lord Frederick Dorran to lead the family, not for his intelligence or his ambition, but because he was malleable, easily bent to their will. The cult had whispered into his ear from a young age, shaping his thoughts, planting seeds of twisted conviction that would eventually blossom into a belief system that justified the slaughter of innocent children. Lord Frederick's every move was dictated by the cult's leaders, who remained hidden in the shadows, pulling strings from behind the scenes. He had never been the true power behind the Dorrans. He was nothing more than a puppet, dancing on strings woven by a force far more ancient and more powerful than anything the world had ever known. Lady Beatrice, too, was caught in the web of the cult's control. Though she wore the mask of a loving wife and mother, beneath it she was no different from her husband, blind to the true cost of the sacrifices they were making. She had been carefully molded by the cult's leaders, taught to see the suffering of the children as a necessary evil, a price to pay for the so-called greater good. The Dorrans had become mere instruments of the cult's dark vision. They had no choice but to obey, for the price of disobedience was unimaginable. The cult's influence over them was absolute. their power so overwhelming that the Dorrans had lost the ability to see right from wrong. They believed in their twisted minds that they were serving a higher purpose, that each child they brought into their home, each innocent life they destroyed was part of a divine plan, a plan that would ultimately save the world from the weakness of human frailty. The sacrifices had begun slowly over generations, with each one building on the last. The Dorrans had convinced themselves that they were preserving their family's bloodline, that they were keeping the family dynasty intact by purging it of the impurities of innocence and weakness. The children they took in were never meant to be loved. They were never meant to have a future. They were nothing more than vessels empty and ready to be filled with the cult's perverse vision of purity. With each death, the Dorrans grew more powerful. They accumulated wealth and influence using the children's blood to fuel the cult's unholy rituals. The cost of their actions was staggering, but the Dorrans had long ceased to care about the price. To them it was a small sacrifice compared to the greater good they believed they were serving. They were trapped in a cycle of violence, unable to break free, their souls consumed by the belief that their actions were justified. As Graves uncovered more about the cult of purity, he realized that the Dorrans were not the only ones caught in its grasp. The cult's influence extended far beyond the manor, reaching into the very heart of Brindlewood. The town had been slowly poisoned by the cult's presence, its citizens unaware of the silent force that had been shaping their lives for so long. The mayor, the sheriff, even the local church had all been infiltrated by the cult's agents. They were all complicit in the Dorrans' actions, either through fear or manipulation. The town was nothing more than a pawn in the cult's game, its people unaware that they were being controlled by forces far beyond their comprehension. Graves knew that the Dorrans were just one part of a much larger and more dangerous puzzle. The town of Brindlewood, the families who had been torn apart by the Dorrans' actions, were all victims of a system that had been carefully constructed to maintain the cult's power. The Dorrans were not the true enemy. They were merely the visible manifestation of something far darker, something that had been festering in the shadows for generations. The true horror lay in the realization that the cult had been pulling the strings for so long that it was now impossible to tell where their influence ended and the Dorrans' actions began. The Dorrans' legacy was one of destruction, of families torn apart, of lives lost, of innocence destroyed in the name of purity. But as Graves delved deeper into the secrets of the Dorran family, he realized that the cost of this legacy was far greater than he could have ever imagined. The town of Brindlewood was forever tainted by the Dorrans' actions, and no matter how much Graves uncovered, the truth would never truly be known. The Dorrans had sealed their fate long ago, and with it the fate of everyone who had ever been touched by their darkness. The family's secret would die with them, buried in the very soil that had given birth to their power. The survivors of the Dorrans' house were not the children they once were. They had emerged from the darkness, but the shadows of their past clung to them, shaping every step they took. The trauma they carried was not just psychological, it was etched into their very souls, a mark they could never erase. They had escaped, yes, but the scars of what they had endured in the Dorrans' house were not so easily left behind. Each survivor had their own version of the horrors they had faced, their own twisted memories, but they all shared one thing: the haunting, relentless whispers of the rituals that had broken them. For years they had lived in silence, each one too terrified to speak, each one carrying their own burden of guilt, of fear, of shame. The memories of those dark days seemed to haunt them like ghosts, never letting them rest. At night their dreams twisted and warped into scenes of unbearable suffering. Children bound, their screams muffled by the walls of the Dorrans' estate, faces distorted by pain, eyes empty and pleading. These dreams were not just figments of their imagination. They were real, seared into their minds, unable to be forgotten. The survivors knew that they had to face their past, but the fear of what would happen if they did, the fear of what the Dorrans might do to them, now kept them in the shadows. The Dorrans had not just stolen their childhood, they had stolen their ability to trust, to feel safe, to believe that the world could ever be anything but dark. But as the years passed, the survivors began to piece together the fragments of their shattered memories. They had survived, and now they would fight to expose the truth, to take back what had been taken from them. They met in secret, a small group of former children, now adults, bound together by their shared horror. Their faces were hardened, their eyes haunted by the things they had witnessed. They had come together with one purpose: to speak the truth, to bring the Dorrans to justice. But the road ahead was not easy. The Dorrans' influence was vast, reaching into every corner of the town, every institution of power. The town's sheriff, the mayor, the priests, even the law itself, each one had been touched by the Dorrans' dark grip. The survivors quickly realized that their battle for justice would not be won easily. The Dorrans had spent years, perhaps decades, weaving themselves into the very fabric of Brindlewood, and now it seemed that every person who might have helped them was either too afraid to speak or too deeply complicit to act. The survivors' efforts were met with silence at every turn. The town refused to listen. Those who had once been their friends had turned their backs on them. The survivors were nothing more than whispers in the wind, their voices drowned out by the crushing weight of the Dorrans' power. Even when they tried to bring the truth to light, their words were dismissed as the ramblings of damaged minds, the result of trauma they could never truly understand. It was as though the town had collectively chosen to forget. The silence surrounding their pain was suffocating, a wall that seemed insurmountable. But the survivors refused to give up. They knew that the truth would one day come to light, and that was the only thing that kept them moving forward. They gathered what evidence they could. Old journals, scraps of documents, any piece of information that might point to the Dorrans' twisted practices. It wasn't enough. Not yet, but it was all they had. Each piece they uncovered brought them closer to exposing the Dorrans' dark legacy, closer to seeing the nightmare end. Still, the fear gnawed at them. The Dorrans had never been the only force at work here. They had always been part of something much larger, a network of power and manipulation that extended far beyond Brindlewood. The survivors knew that if they pushed too hard, they might never make it out alive. The Dorrans were not just a family, they were part of a system that would stop at nothing to protect itself. The deeper the survivors dug, the more they realized that the truth they sought would not be easy to uncover. They would need to fight not only against the Dorrans, but against a society that had turned its back on them, a society that had been complicit in their suffering. But even as the odds seemed impossible, the survivors found strength in each other. They were no longer the broken children who had been brought into the Dorran manor. They were survivors. They had endured the worst, and now they would make sure that their voices would be heard. The town of Brindlewood, for all its silence, would not remain untouched by the truth. The Dorrans' grip on it would not last forever. One day the survivors would make sure of that. They knew the journey would be long and the cost would be high. But they would not stop. They could not stop. The past had broken them, but it had also made them strong. And in the end, the Dorrans' silence would be shattered by the voices of those they had tried to erase. The survivors would take back what had been stolen from them, piece by shattered piece, and the truth, long buried beneath layers of fear and power, would finally rise to the surface, where it could not be ignored any longer. The Dorrans' empire of silence would crumble, one voice at a time. The Dorrans had always been a family shrouded in secrecy, their smiles hiding the abyss that lay just beneath the surface. But even in the darkest corners of Brindlewood, where whispers of their horrors had been long silenced by fear, one truth remained. The Dorrans were not merely driven by greed nor by some twisted sense of righteousness. There was something more, something darker that had bound them to a destiny none could escape. The last remaining witness to the Dorrans' grim history had lived in hiding for years, keeping her guilt buried deep within, knowing that to reveal the truth would be her end. Margaret was the last of the servants who had once served the Dorrans in their house of horrors. She had been there when it all began, the first sacrifice, the first child who had been chosen for their dark rituals. It was Margaret who had watched as innocence was torn apart, as the Dorrans, once benign figures in the town, revealed their true monstrous selves. Her role had been one of passive complicity at first, delivering meals, cleaning rooms, attending to the Dorrans' every need. But as the rituals began, she was pulled into the nightmare, unable to escape the horror unfolding within the manor's walls. She had witnessed the transformation of the Dorrans, how over time they had come to believe they were doing the world a service, sacrificing innocent lives to maintain a dynasty that spanned generations. What Margaret had seen was beyond anything she could have imagined when she first entered the Dorran household. The ceremonies, the strange chants, the blood rituals. It was all so far removed from the life she had known, and yet she was powerless to stop it. For years, Margaret had kept her silence. Her guilt ate away at her, gnawing at the core of her being, but she was too afraid to speak out. The Dorrans' power extended far beyond Brindlewood, and they had eyes everywhere. But now, with the years weighing heavily on her frail body and the memory of what she had witnessed haunting her every waking hour, Margaret could no longer stay hidden in the shadows. The truth had to come out. She was the only one left who knew the full extent of the Dorrans' horrors, and if she didn't speak now, the legacy of their evil would continue unchallenged. It was in a small cottage on the edge of the village where Margaret finally agreed to meet with Jonathan Graves, the man who had spent years chasing the truth about the Dorrans. Her hands shook as she sat in front of him, the weight of her years and the memories she carried pressing down on her fragile frame. Her eyes, once filled with the vibrancy of youth, now held only sorrow. She had lived a lifetime of regret, and the words she was about to speak were words that had been locked away for far too long. "You don't understand," she began, her voice trembling. "The Dorrans, they weren't just evil in the way you think. They weren't just monstrous because they killed those children. They were evil because they made a pact, an ancient one. The wealth, the power, the influence, they weren't just byproducts of cruelty, they were gifts, granted to them by forces beyond this world." Margaret's words hung in the air like a curse. Graves, ever methodical, leaned in, his mind racing. "A pact? With whom?" Margaret's voice faltered as she spoke again, her words tinged with fear, as though speaking them aloud might shatter whatever fragile grip she had left on her sanity. "With something darker than anything you can imagine. The cult of purity wasn't just a group of twisted individuals. They were a front for something much worse. A supernatural force that promised the Dorrans eternal life in exchange for their obedience. The first sacrifice was made not to prove a point, but to bind them to that force. The cult's leaders, they didn't just believe in purity, they believed in immortality, attainable only through blood, through ritual, through the breaking of children's spirits. Graves sat back, stunned by the enormity of what Margaret had just revealed. It was more than he could process in a single moment. The Dorrans, tied to a supernatural force? His entire investigation, his entire understanding of the case was suddenly shaken to its core. The rituals had always felt more than just cruel. There had always been something otherworldly about them. But now the supernatural aspect was undeniable. The Dorrans' power, their resilience, their ability to escape justice. It wasn't just about influence or fear. It was something much darker. They had made a deal, a pact that had granted them an immortality far beyond human reach. How long has this been going on?" Graves asked, his voice barely a whisper, as though afraid to hear the answer. "Since the beginning," Margaret replied, her eyes distant as though seeing the horrors all over again. "The first sacrifice was made over a century ago, but the cult had been waiting for the right family, the right bloodline to carry out their work. The Dorrans were chosen long before they even knew what was happening. Lord Frederick, his father, his grandfather, they were all part of it, trapped in the same cycle of sacrifice and rebirth. Every generation of Dorrans has been bound to this pact." Graves felt his stomach twist, the implications of her words heavy with dread. The Dorrans had never been ordinary. They had been part of something far larger, far older than anyone had realized. Their power wasn't just wealth, it was supernatural, an unholy covenant that ensured their survival, their dominance, their ability to destroy without consequence. "But the children? What about them?" Graves asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "They were the price," Margaret said, tears welling in her eyes. "Each one was a sacrifice to feed the pact, to keep the Dorrans' bloodline pure and immortal. They were never meant to survive. They were tools, pawns in a game that no one could ever truly escape. The truth had been buried for so long, hidden beneath layers of lies and fear. But now it was out in the open, and the horror was undeniable. The Dorrans had built their empire not just on cruelty, but on an ancient pact with a dark force that ensured their immortality. They had lived for generations, feeding off the lives of children bound by a supernatural contract that no one, not even they, could escape. And as Margaret's voice trailed off, Graves knew that this was just the beginning. The legacy of the Dorrans' evil was far deeper than anyone had imagined, and the cost of their immortality was one that would never be paid in full. The Dorrans' empire didn't fall in a single moment. It eroded piece by piece as truth began to seep into the cracks. It started with the survivors, the forgotten children who had once lived in the family's shadow. Their voices, once silenced, began to rise. They had been scattered, broken, hidden in plain sight. But now they were speaking. Now they were being heard. They weren't children anymore. Grief lived in. Their eyes and scars marked their skin, but their strength was no longer something the Dorrans could bend. Together they began to remember. Together they told the truth. And slowly the walls began to tremble. The Dorrans had wrapped their influence around the entire town. The sheriff, the mayor, the church, the schools. No corner of Brindlewood had escaped their reach. For years, people had looked away, afraid of what might happen if they didn't. But the voices of the survivors were growing louder, and the town had started to listen. The first shifts were small: an unsigned letter, a whispered phone call, a name spoken aloud that no one had dared to say in years. And then the silence cracked. A few stood up. And just like that, the fear began to bleed out of the town. But the Dorrans fought back. People disappeared. Records vanished. Those who spoke up were erased from memory like they'd never existed. Graves had been the first, but there were others: journalists, teachers, officials, anyone who tried to pull back the curtain. Still, the survivors didn't stop. They knew what they were facing. They understood the cost. The Dorrans' power wasn't just money. It was rot. It was ritual. It was something older than politics, something buried deep inside the institutions that protected them. The cult that had lived beneath the Dorran name had embedded itself everywhere. Its roots were long, its reach devastating. But even the deepest rot begins to surface. One by one, the Dorrans' allies began to splinter. The sheriff stopped answering calls. The mayor couldn't sleep. Old loyalties wavered beneath the weight of guilt. Lord Frederick Dorran, so certain of his untouchable legacy, stood cornered. Lady Beatrice watched the world she had shaped begin to disintegrate. They had believed that no one would ever dare speak. But the survivors were no longer afraid. And the truth was louder than fear. The full story came out. The rituals, the sacrifices, the children, the family's crimes stretched back generations. And the town, shaken, ashamed, began to rise. There were no more whispered warnings, no more closed doors. The arrests were swift, the trial relentless. The Dorrans' secrets were dragged into the light and left there to rot. Frederick, Beatrice, every name attached to the legacy of pain. They were convicted without mercy. But even justice couldn't erase what had been done. The children were gone. The scars were permanent. And Brindlewood, though changed, would never return to what it had been. The survivors had fought, and they had won. But the price was immeasurable. And in the silence that followed, something darker remained. The Dorrans were gone, but their shadow still clung to the town like smoke that would not lift. The streets were quieter now, but the quiet didn't feel safe. It felt watched. Brindlewood had new laws, new promises, but the survivors knew what the town had learned too late. Evil doesn't always look like a monster. Sometimes it smiles, sometimes it wears a suit, sometimes it's the name carved on a statue in front of City Hall. The Dorrans had been allowed to thrive because no one wanted to see them. That was the truth the survivors would never forget. And somewhere in the parts of town still untouched by mourning, the question lingered. Not could it happen again, but how long until it does?